Welcome to the second part of backwards design and alignment mapping for course design. In this second video, we're going to take a look at course objective or module objective 2 here, where we're going to explain the tenets of the backwards design model in a little bit more detail. In the first video, we differentiated between what is typically instructor-centered course design versus student-centered course design. And we spoke a little bit about how backwards design really does feed into that student-centered course design, creating engaging and authentic learning activities, and at the same time making sure that there's alignment. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that now in this particular part of the series. So the tenets of backwards design. When we look at the main pieces of working with a backwards design model, the very first step always needs to be writing those objectives. We have our course level objectives and our module level objectives. The course level objectives are the big ideas and specific understandings that will be gained for application outside of the context of the course. So for example, knowing how to make justifications, how to create things, evaluating and summarizing would fit a lot of these higher level course level objectives. There's typically 5 to 8, maybe a little more, maybe fewer, total course level objectives in a course. But then as we teach a course, whether you decide to design a course by units, 10 units, 8 units, or by modules, maybe you're going to use, which may also be synonymous with units, 10 or 8 modules, or by week, every single one of those smaller chunked breakdowns of the whole, let's just say it's a weekly design, 15 weeks in the course, we're going to have 15 weekly modules. Each one is broken down into its very more granular module level objectives. The key knowledge and skills learners will gain within each subsection of the course as part of their journey to attain the course level objectives. Again, typically looking at about 5 to 8 module level objectives per unit or per module. So over a 15-week course, if we have on average 5 module level objectives, we're looking at, let's see, 5 times 15, 75 module level objectives over the course itself. If I've done my math correctly, I hope I have. Let's see, 15 times 5. Yes, that should be 75. So when we think about course objectives, I love this ladder when it comes to Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's is always my starting point. What are those verbs that really put the student at the center that I need to think about? It's not about what will the faculty member do or the instructor do in order to get students to learn. It's what are students going to do to demonstrate that they have learned or to apply the information. The highest rungs of the ladder are your highest levels of Bloom's. And I would recommend to anyone that your course level objectives really should be focused on these higher levels of Bloom's. Things like develop or create, justify or criticize, and even compare, distinguish, and discover. You could make an argument that there probably should be at least a few mid to lower level Bloom's mixed in some course objectives, depending on whether it's a 100 level, 300 level course, for example, undergraduate versus graduate school. But applying their information, right? Things like construct, identify, or just demonstrating simple understanding like explaining, rephrase, or illustrate. Those types of verbs should be used when thinking about those course level objectives. Our module level objective should feed into this. So if I have a course level objective, as an example, that requires students to take a position and justify that position, then I need to have in a module building them up to that, where at first maybe they have to identify different positions on a topic and understand, right, explain or rephrase why different groups might take those positions. And ultimately, we'll have, for example, discussions around those things or activities around those things. And when we get to that larger idea of now you're actually going to take a stance, you've been exposed to these different positions, now you need to actually take a stance and justify from a certain perspective. we've now reached and attained that course level objective, or at least we are requiring students to demonstrate that they have attained. Planning assessments. All of our assessments, our big ones, right, our summatives, things typically like exams or term papers, should all be geared toward those course level objectives. Our formative assessments are typically geared toward our module level objectives within the module. But again, I'll make the argument that even every module should have a mini summative assessment, some sort of culminating quiz at the end of the module, or culminating discussion, culminating activity. So if we thought of this as tiers, I would say things like a typical homework or a typical discussion board might be the lowest tier of formative, where students are going to receive feedback and they're going to be able to use that feedback to make adjustments real time in the course during that module, before they get to the end of that module, where now there isn't quite as much feedback, but they're taking some sort of chapter quiz or module quiz to wrap it up. So as the layout here speaks about, formative are more diagnostic than evaluative. They're really to break down where are the gaps in your learning, right? So when you submit this 5-question short answer homework and I reply with where you as a student have responded appropriately versus areas where you need more clarification, hopefully you can take my advice, my facilitation, and use that to improve when we actually get to that chapter test, for example. So back to Bloom's, you'll notice that this particular pyramid is sort of inverted compared to the ladder. The ladder had more of a typical triangle shape where the base would be at the bottom, versus on this diagram, we see the base is sort of at the top. So thinking about a module, for example, a lot of our formative assessments will probably fit in the remembering, understanding, and maybe even applying areas of this diagram, where we're asking students to list and find and identify and locate things. Again, these typically, hopefully we can see how we'd see that in most likely a homework assignment of some sort, or a practice, or even in some of that group work where the group just needs to describe something. Understanding, they're summarizing and explaining and paraphrasing. And we may see that in discussion posts. And again, that feedback just constantly comes back to the students, either from peer-to-peer feedback or instructor-to-student feedback. We're applying that information, or making a chart, or drawing, or applying, or solving, or calculating a problem in a chemistry class, for example. We're taking what we've learned of the basics and we're applying it. And again, we're getting feedback on the steps and that multi-step equation. All of this is done throughout a module before they get to that end of module quiz or chapter test, and definitely before they eventually get to a midterm or final exam. But all of those filter back to what is the module level objective or module level objectives? What are they requiring of students, and how do those objectives filter back to the course objectives? So when we compare formative and summative, right? Formative forms part of the instructional process, helps teachers modify teaching methods. It includes things like quizzes, voting in lessons, homework, classwork, exit surveys, KWLs. Summatives, on the other hand, determine what students know at a particular point in time. There's a little less feedback typically with summatives, because think about a final exam, usually that is the last thing before they leave the course. And even though they may get the score back, they may or may not have an opportunity to use that feedback to rectify something. So end of year assessments, mid-term final exams, end of projects, portfolios, things along these lines. Both are ways to assess students, and both can be used for feedback, although formative typically has more. Definitely both are used for future lesson planning. When we think about planning learning activities, right, the types of things that will get students to perform well on those assessments. Again, I want to reiterate where this is backwards design, right? We start with the end in mind, the course objectives. Then we go one more step backwards, look at all the module objectives. Then we go one more step backwards, we look at the summative assessments. One more step backwards, the formative assessments. Okay, so now we know how we're going to measure them. What are we going to do as instructors to get them prepared for those measurements. What are the activities? What are the interactions? What are the tools and resources? And really the best way I can speak to this is to speak about it in the form of questioning, really being a self-assessor as an instructor. In which activities will learners engage and absorb course content to obtain the knowledge? Is reading through a PDF or a PowerPoint the best way to obtain this module level objective, which eventually feeds into those course objectives? Or would an instructional video be better? Would something dealing with practice be better, where they're using an online simulation, let's say, or a face-to-face discussion in a face-to-face classroom? Remember, not all of these things apply only to the online environment. All of these things really do apply even in a face-to-face environment. So are they related to real-world applications? Students, believe it or not, really do want to know, how am I going to use this in the future? So can we design, even in the formative role plays, ways in which we're putting them in a situation where you might actually experience this on the job one day, or just in life in general? Are the activities chunked pragmatically? The diagram to the right here, content just sort of lumped into one gigantic PowerPoint or one gigantic video does not give anyone time to really digest the information. Yes, they can hit pause, absolutely. But chunking this information and then immediately asking students to apply it actually helps with cognitive load. Our brains, we absorb information better if we get it in smaller chunks, and then we can also immediately apply it. That's where our module level objectives come into play. So if you think of it as each one of these bars off here to the right that's been chopped into pieces relating directly to one module level objective, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different module level objectives. And maybe it's watch a video, answer some questions, reaches this first few module level objectives. Or as they're watching your lecture, you have questions built in along the way. Do the activities support? And that's backwards design again. They always need to support the module level objectives within the module that they're being built, but obviously which course objectives they need to support that as well. And they will not support all course objectives. It may only be 2 of your 5. Interactions. How will learners engage to practice the course content? Do they engage with each other, student to student, in discussion boards, or in role plays, or in breakout rooms in Zoom, or in your face-to-face class in the lab? Working side by side, and people have certain roles in the lab that they need to fulfill. Do the interactions provide opportunities for them to interact with you? Students listening to an instructor give a lecture is an interaction, but it is very passive. When they actually can be involved in absorbing that information on their own is a much more powerful learning experience for a student than passive learning. Active learning, lab is a great example of this. I may give a 10 or 15-minute lecture on how to do something, and then they're going to immediately, in its chunks, notice, take those things that we spoke about and apply them in the lab. That hands-on experience is much more powerful and useful for the students than just seeing someone demonstrate it and only watching. Obviously, there are some circumstances where that's needed, especially if safety comes into play. But in areas where students can actually be involved, it's a much, much more powerful learning experience. The tools. Which tools will be required to use? In a typical face-to-face class, in a chemistry class, there's going to be certain tools that are going to be required to use. They should obviously relate to the real world. In a fully online course, are we using so many tools that they're not necessarily needed, and students are sort of getting a second curriculum, here's how you use tools curriculum, or do these support the module and course level learning objectives? If I'm asking you to discuss things, am I actually leveraging discussion forums and things where students have an opportunity to present their case, to make an argument, or to take and defend a perspective? So again, back to alignment. What does this mean? That the learning goals and objectives, both course level and module level, are directly influencing the types of assessments that students will be taking, and that feedback should be constant, and that the learning activities and teaching activities that take place are directly related to the kinds of assessments students will be required to perform. And that all of this is interconnected. This is what we call alignment, and the student is at the center. It's really about the student experience in this course alignment. Here's another way to look at backwards design. We may have institutional and program outcomes we need to pay attention to, but I'm going to jump right to our course level outcomes. The skills, knowledge, and abilities that students will have gained from taking your course. There are clearly stated expectations of performance. And our 5 to 8 course level objectives feed, if you will, or drive, guide all of the module level objectives that we'll create. So again, back to our very simple idea of having 5 modules and perhaps 5 module objectives per module, right? We're going to have approximately 75 module level objectives throughout the entire course in that kind of case. So based on the appropriate grouping and specific objectives that lead to the course level outcomes, what we're looking at is taking it in a more granular way. Our course level objectives are going to be higher level blooms typically. Our module level objectives are going to be mid to lower level blooms typically. And then from there, now we can design our appropriate assessments. We're going to design our summative assessments that most likely relate to our course level outcomes, and our formative assessments that most likely relate to our module level objectives. And we may even have some module level objectives that are measured by smaller summative assessments like chapter or module quizzes. And finally, our activities and interactions, our technology, everything that is chosen on how they're going to obtain knowledge, how they're going to practice that knowledge, and role plays and simulations and in labs and all of those kinds of things, and homework assignments. All of this needs to directly correlate to those module level objectives, because they're going to perform on those formative and summative assessments, which we as instructors are going to give them a ton of feedback on, so they can practice and they can rectify before they take those summatives or submit those summatives. In the next part of our series, we're going to take a look at using a backwards design tool to actually implement the backwards design model.